All right, it looks like we're at critical mass, so we'll go ahead and get started. So hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar. We're very pleased to have you with us. As we get started, I'd like to encourage everyone again to introduce yourself in the chat box. We would love to know your name, organization, and where you're joining us from today. Next slide, please, Matheson. Before we begin, we want to make sure everyone knows that French interpretation is available for this webinar. If you would like to follow the event in French, please click on the small globe at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation, and then select your preferred language. Once you've selected your language, you can choose to mute the original audio, or you can hear it in the background at a lower volume. If you have any technical issues during the session, please send a chat message to Scale Tech Support. We will do our best to assist you. Please note that if you have any questions for our panelists today, we would like you to post your question in the chat box, which you can find also at the bottom of your screen. Now I'll pass things over to Carrie, who will be leading us through today's webinar. Over to you, Carrie.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here today for Scale's culmination webinar on the markets and livelihoods resources and tools that we've pulled together. As many of you know, Scale is designed to support research, capacity strengthening, knowledge sharing for BHA, USAID BHA, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance partners. And the purpose of Scale is really to strengthen the impact, sustainability, and scalability of USAID's agriculture, natural resource, and livelihood programs that are both on and off farm, as well as in emergency and non-emergency contexts. So let's get started. Today's webinar, we want to bring you those highlighted resources, particularly the markets and livelihoods resources that have been developed over the life of Scale. We know there are a lot of challenges in the contexts that we work, and also on the issues we work on, whether you're talking about food security or resilience. These are complex issues. And so although we're sharing these resources, we also want to really create a space where we can talk about how the resources fit together, because we know there's always going to be a need for more than one area of technical support, or how these things fit together, I think, is really important. So you're first going to hear from 4 presenters about different resources that they have worked on and worked with. But we also really want to make this an opportunity, like I said, to chat about how they fit together. And hey, you've got 4 technical advisors with you here. So please put your questions in the chat. There'll be a question and answer session towards the end, and we'll get to some of those questions. But if you've got something more complex, you'll be able to raise your hand, and we'll take questions from the audience, however you feel that fits best for you. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. We're going to start out this morning with Ashley Ahrens, who previously worked with us at Scale, but comes to us today from Oxfam, where he's working on market systems development programs in Asia. So Ashley's going to be talking about a resource that looks at how we can apply market system thinking to employment programs, which I think is really important, because I've seen a lot of employment programs they're kind of a bit siloed and feel like they haven't upgraded much since we first designed employment programs. So it's a great resource for thinking how you bring a systems approach or a market systems approach to that type of program. And then we're going to hear from Tom Shaw, who many of you are familiar with his microfinance work at CRS. Tom is going to talk about the new private service provider trainings that are there's a course that's recently available, and it's really designed to help those savings groups become more sustainable. And we know savings groups then are the foundation of a lot of the markets and livelihoods activities that we do. Next, we'll hear from Maha Hayek, who joins us from the Markets in Crisis group. She's going to tell us about some of the new resources that were developed under Scale. And they're resources that are really there to help emergency and development practitioners bridge that gap between humanitarian work and development work when they're working on markets in emergency contexts. And then finally, you'll hear from me again. I'm Carrie Byrne, and I am Scale's Livelihood Advisor. And I am going to launch a new resource on livelihoods in migration contexts. So hot off the press, literally only got its link yesterday. We're going to launch that. And I think it's really, a lot of people are saying it's really timely that this is coming out now. I know I've seen a lot on migration in the press, and I think folks who are working on livelihoods are keen to keep getting better at what they're doing, because we can tell we're not quite fitting the need that's out there. And then, like I said, we'll move to questions. And but please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go along, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So great. With that, Ashley, why don't you get us going?
Thanks so much. Well, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about employment, but great to see so many of old colleagues from Scale and Mercy Corps, as well as the new ones. So thanks for coming here today. So next slide, please. So I feel like with all these presenters, I need to pitch this tool. So essentially, questions I would have, do you work in youth employment, but you want to have a bigger impact through systems change? Like you feel your work's not sustainable enough, not leaving behind this bigger impact? If yes, then this webinar, this tool is for you. Do you work in market systems development, maybe in agricultural markets? And historically, this approach has come more from there, or financial inclusion, but you want to know, how do I bring those principles into employment programming? Then this tool is for you. So if either of these, if you tick either of those things, you're definitely in the right place. If you so you'll no to both of them, well, hopefully I'll still manage to inspire you to think about those. Next slide. So this is the tool. It is what the name says. It's looking at comparing standard and market systems development approaches to rural employment. So rural jobs, what does it look like to move from this direct approach to a market systems approach? And it tries to be quite, I'm going to give a few of the kind of key points in this, but I would hope afterwards, if you're interested, you go and read it. And tries to make some of these quite difficult questions, at least I think quite difficult, a bit more accessible. Next slide. So the reason I worked on this for Scale is that I think there are a lot of rural youth employment programs out there. But I think, unfortunately, what I saw in my previous role was generally they had limited results. And that was partly there's sometimes too much hubris. Like in rural areas, there's not that many jobs that are possible. You can change all you want, but that's partly why you're doing that work, partly why we're so interested in migration. So sometimes our expectations were a bit too high. But within what we were doing, I think a lot of programs are overly focused on labor supply, training people for jobs that don't exist, often taking a direct approach, focusing on training people or giving out money rather than building up the system. And often I'd see kind of quite agricultural programs taking quite a strong market systems approach, but on the employment side, coming back to this more direct work. That was interesting. And I think partly that's explained that there's a lot of different views maybe about what a systems approach is. So I tried to provide some clarity in this. So yeah, this document tries to answer some of those questions there. Next slide. So what does it include? Well, the first thing is actually it tries to suggest a new way to conceptualize labor markets. I think from my experience, if you're working in kind of on-farm, in a lot of contexts, you'll find there's 3 or 4 value chains where there's a lot of people working in them. And so it makes sense to really focus on them. So, maize, beans, horticulture, whatever they may be. But when you get into the non-farm stuff, let's say tailoring, construction in rural areas, whatever it might be, you see so many different sectors, but all with a very small number of people. That's a kind of caricaturization. But essentially, then it's hard, how do you pick these specific value chains to work in? And so what I suggest on the right in the document is a new way to think about labor markets as having the labor supply on the left-hand side, you see that red circle, and then on the right-hand side, these two systems of labor demand, both the micro-enterprise system and the wage employment system, with various key functions around them. So labor supply, the skill side, childcare perhaps, labor demand, microfinance, enterprise kind of training perhaps, market access, and so on. And the idea is that this is actually, it feels like a lot of work here, but once you start thinking this way about how labor markets work, it really can help quite a lot. And I would say for rural areas, I mean, this is a very generic image, is to suggest we do a lot of the stuff in the red on labor supply, but my suggestion would be in rural areas to really try to cut that down, because you're working in environments where there are few jobs, hence focusing more on labor demand. So in an example I'll talk about later, we looked at on labor supply, thinking about migration routes as part of that. Next slide. So the resource talks about labor systems, and then the heart of it though is kind of what you see here, to think about this, I guess, spectrum from a direct approach to a market systems approach. And you'll see column 1, which is like a direct approach where your organization might give trainings yourselves, or you give out cash yourselves. Then the second one, what we call here a transactional partnership approach, I used to call an improved direct approach, is where we pay a permanent market actor to provide a service. And that's quite common, for instance, under the training sector, where we would pay often training centers to provide a service. And then the third column, though, is, I guess, what I think we should really be aiming for, which is about supporting market actors to sustainably do something in a way that they will continue doing after the program ends. So to maybe support training center to provide a service that they will keep on providing when the program ends. And then the fourth approach is I would call the kind of full MSD approach, where you're trying to use a small number of interventions to change the whole system. Maybe using the one in the third column as a leverage point or some way to influence other market actors. I think, some of the question is, how do we do this? And the report talks a lot more about that. But I think thinking in terms of these columns is actually very helpful for us to understand where we are. And the idea is that we can incrementally move. If you're on column 1, you're not going to get to 4, I think, but perhaps. But it's rather, let's try to move a little bit where we can. And at least column 3, I think, is a good endpoint. Next slide. And then a report provides a bit more details. It provides an example of the program rallies. I think since I've left, has had some struggles. But the point here isn't so much the program, it's rather looking at how they think about different sectors. So there's some cross-cutting, like micro-enterprise savings, a couple of specific product kind of value chains. They also did work in camel milk, and I think so cow milk and maybe dairy, to show that if you are working in rural areas, you do need to think very much about still be working in the on-farm areas. For those of you interested, it dives further into some of the key principles. So what does sustainability and scalability mean differently for these different 4 approaches? So you understand where they're coming from to get to where they're going, I guess. What does it look like different across a program cycle? If you're designing a program, maybe for measurement, for staff capacity, for whatever, what does it mean, your different approaches? And then it talks a bit about the challenges for MSD programs. I'm aware that I've come from a certain background. Perhaps I haven't worked into some of the context of some of the people here. But what it tries to see is how you can adapt the approach perhaps to some of the most difficult environments, what it might mean a bit differently in certain places. And also being aware that this is quite new to bring MSD to rural areas. So there isn't really any evidence, which it admits and kind of says, let's work with that. And so with that, I've seen there's lots of questions. I'll try to come back to them, but great to be part of this discussion with you all.
Thanks, Ashley. That's it's a great resource, and anyone working on employment programs or even working with systems issues that wants to kind of see a different way of looking at it and thinking about labor, I think it's really a worthwhile paper to look at. We're going to move quickly on to Tom. First I want to say the corrected link, apologies for that. The corrected link is in the chat. And as Ashton has said, we will we'll share all the links for all of these documents and more after the event as well. But let me move us on to Tom, who's going to talk to us about the private service provider tools and resources that have recently been developed.
Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to be fairly brief. CRS, we have always looked at the savings group opportunity as something that needs to be sustainable and scalable beyond projects. So the question we asked in the very beginning, back in 2008, was what is the best way to ensure that all those who want to be in some form of savings group can do it and can get the training? Because we've been confronted with the projects that are either too short or too focused for the ability of whatever agents are trained to meet demand. And we have the issue that not everyone is an early adopter. Many people have to see that it works well before they're willing to try. So what we've done is invest in local people from the communities who become what we call SILK, that is our brand name for savings groups, private service providers. So fee-for-service agents who are available over the long term to provide these services. We're using a market-based model that provides income to these SILK PSP agents, and in return, they provide continued access to saving group services for communities. With this model, we reach more people over time, and it is not bound by project timeline. So just a quick note that what the innovation is right now is we've moved in collaboration with Mercy Corps, actually it's a Mercy Corps-led initiative, to develop online e-learning tools, which are somewhat facilitated for certain of them in order to train at the supervisor level. We do not train at the agent level virtually, but we are looking to train at the supervisor level to really get this out into a much larger scalable methodology. Next slide, please. So when we look at our model, we basically have a process that takes somewhere between 8 and 12 months. We recruit from the communities, those that are very entrepreneurial, who are willing to eventually work for a fee that they will charge to the groups. And we've conducted the training. After about 7 months, if they're ready, 7-8 months, this culminates in an examination process with 3 components. We do focus group discussions with the groups they've started, and each agent must start 6 groups. We then look at the data, which is in Savix, and see what the performance of the groups have been, and then each agent or field agent goes through an oral exam through a panel. And those that pass this test then are certified and introduces the community now as private service providers, and that they may then charge for their services to the groups that they start forming after that time. And if over time there is a lot more demand in communities, because we think that over time there is more demand of what we're seeing, then these PSPs are able to take on apprentices whom they train and who will then be certified within their networks in order to provide more and a larger range of access to communities. Next slide, please. So the keys to the success of this methodology is that it starts from day one of the project. There's no intermediary. We already know, and the people selected, the people trained already know that it's them as entrepreneurs that will move this forward and not some kind of handout or some kind of salary, although they do get a small stipend during the training. We make sure that there are clear, consistent, and frequent messaging to all the stakeholders in order to clearly identify that this is a market approach and this is not a subsidy. This is just to get people ready to the point where they can provide the services. And we look to prepare the market for the PSPs as they get ready to be certified, so that we're consistently making the same messages across the communities. Because we need to make sure that the agents have a smooth transition from being a field agent in training to a private service provider who is getting paid for their services. And we have found this to be very successful across all the countries we have worked in. Next slide, please. So in looking at the data, in the initial work we did to design the model between 2008 2012, we were working with 14 partners across 3 countries. We ended up creating 375,000 members in savings groups, and we conducted a randomized controlled trial which demonstrated that PSPs outperformed a paid agent, a paid field agent model on all financial indicators. And we also noted that the poverty outreach, starting with the people, most members at the beginning of joining a savings group were in the 2nd or 3rd quartile, so very much lower on the poverty scale, and thus the clients that we think we are attracting by this. But we did see a very wide variation in PSP performance after certification, because it's whatever level they want to do. In some cases, we had people in Kenya who were doing 40 groups at a time, and in other cases, in another country, they may have been doing 3 or 4 or 5 at a time. As this is an entrepreneurial activity, each agent has to decide how much effort they put into this and how much they want to gain from it. So the end result of the 4 years of creation of the model was the PSP implementation manual, which there will be a link to in the last slide. Then we sort of looked at how can we refine this model to be more inclusive, because we realized that not everybody in communities is joining, and that perhaps even being in the 2nd or 3rd quartile in communities, we're not going deep enough. So we did another project with MasterCard Foundation funding from 2013 to 2017, in which 10 partners across 4 countries created 543,000 savings group members. And here we found that 2/3 of the members came from the poor half of the communities, and the more groups formed in an individual community, the higher was the proportion of members who are coming from the poorest segments of the community. So we're really looking at focusing on a pro-poor approach that is really going deep into the communities and multiple groups and reaching. By the end of the project, 90% of the first cycle groups, which is when they would be paying for the services, paid their PSP. And we found that from the point of view of the PSPs, doing Silk was either their first or second income source for 75% of them. And in a post-project study, 19 months after the end of the project, conducted by ITAD, we found that 5% of the groups had dissolved, meaning 95% were still there. 85% of the PSPs were continuing to form groups at the same rate during the project, of at least 1 group per month, and that we had a 56% increase in membership, and this is post-project. What we found is that the PSP networks were very helpful in moving this forward, but actually require much more significant support than we had initially invested in. So that is something we're working on now. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to present here is simply the access to the tools. Our Field Agent Guide 5.1 is available, which is what is part of the e-learning training, along with the PSP implementation manual. And you can find many other research and training resources at crs.org/silk. You can find the e-learning training, the webinar for the launch of the e-learning training, which we did a little over a month ago, at the link And the modules are all posted on disasterready.org, at least for Silk. As of last Friday, the PSP link was still pending, but will be up very soon. Mercy Corps is working very hard to get it up on disasterready.org. And then there have been other webinars within the series of the SCALE project, one of which was Building Household Resilience with Inclusive Financial and Market Systems, that is worthwhile of you taking a look at in order to look at the more holistic way of dealing with this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to quickly move us along to Maha to keep us tight on time. And I just want to remind our exciting panelists, as excited as you get about the resources, please do remember to speak slowly because we have a French interpreter as well. I know I'm often guilty of speaking too quickly. So Maha, over to you.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. I'll talk today about the market-based programming framework, which I consider a foundational resource and a great guidance document for people working on both development and the humanitarian areas in fragile contexts. So let's start. Next slide, please. Okay, through our work with emergency practitioners in different fragile contexts, there were some common feedback and common misconceptions from those practitioners. And we hear things like, we are working in emergency situations, we are saving people, not developing markets, so markets is not our job. We don't have the time in our program to wait and build a response of market actors. And others even couldn't figure out how their work relates to markets. And they say things like, I'm working in WASH, so markets do not really relate to my work. So what should I do with markets? Next slide, please. So actually, like these misconceptions generated many questions that deserve to be addressed, like what is exactly the market-based programming and how does it fit with the emergency situations in particular? And also how market-based programming still can save lives, even if we work with markets and not directly with our target group in some cases. And finally, how the markets are interlinked with all our activities and all the sectors or areas that our target groups involved in. Next, please. So to answer all these questions, the Market in a Crisis Community of Practice designed this market-based programming framework. It was designed in 2015 and updated in 2017 and recently in 2022. Next, please. Okay, just to remind you about the Market in a Crisis Community of Practice, this community is what we call MIC. It's around 3,000 practitioners where they have this platform in which they can share ideas, experiences, resources, and also they can ask for help or support if needed. So if you are not a member, you still have the chance to join this community and enjoy the discussions. Actually, the MIC Advisory Committee this year, with the support of SCALE, has created a number of new resources in different formats and in multiple languages to be accessible to more people. Next. Okay, so these resources, which include the market-based programming framework document that I'm presenting today, includes also a video. This video explains the core idea of the market-based programming, in addition to a sector-specific document, which focusing in applying market-based programming to shelter in particular. These resources are available in English, Arabic, Spanish, and French, so they are accessible also to many people, so that you can share through network. You can find all these resources in the MIC webpage on SCALE website, and for sure we will share the link for you, so it will be easy for you to check them. As I told, I'm focusing on one resource today, which is the market-based programming framework, and I'll just give you an idea about this resource. I think many of you are familiar with the donut chart from the MSD or market for good approach. The market-based programming framework uses the same ideas that are built on the systemic thinking, but what is different in this framework is adopted more to a humanitarian context. So it will tell you more how to apply systemic thinking into humanitarian contexts in particular. Next, please. So this resource will be really helpful for you if you are working in fragile context or in emergency situation, and you want to improve your impact through introducing or improving the use of market-based approaches into your program. Or if you are this person who is working on or interested in this humanitarian and development nexus, and you want to understand the shared language between humanitarian and development actors to understand more how to bridge this gap or to be more able to make such discussions with these actors. And also, if you are looking for a good guidance document for your team, that this document will firstly help them to evaluate their current performance to see where they are from the market-based approaches, and it will also help them to reflect the market-based programming principles into practical actions and in different sectors. So if you are working in one of these three, or you are interested in one of these three, I think this resource is really for you, especially that under this resource, next slide, in this resource, you will find a really clear and simple explanation about the approach and how it relates to the different sectors we are working on in both emergency and recovery situation, and how to go through these stages. Also, the types of the market-based programming and the range of activities that can be implemented are also explained with helpful examples from various sectors. So it's like a foundational document that you can easily navigate through. So I hope this will be helpful for you, but I just want to add one final point, brief and quick. In my final point, that we all know that working on such approaches needs a change in the mindset and in our ways of working. And to start this, I think the adaptive management principles are one of the most critical and needed principles to be mainstreamed in our working. That's why I'm sharing with you these resources that also created by Scale. These are two briefs about the adaptive management to livelihood emergency settings in particular. One of them is talking about the challenges and the opportunities, and the other one is mainly about how to strengthen the adaptive management in this programming. There is also a webinar. In this webinar, these two briefs were discussed, in addition to some case studies in adaptive management. I think these resources will be helpful, and I consider them complementary to the market-based programming. That's all from me, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Maha. Thank you. I realize, let me just put in the link here for those last two resources, because I didn't give it to our background folks. So there you go. There's the link for those last two resources. Thank you to all the panelists. And let me just say now, I am super, super excited to launch our Migration in Livelihoods, Livelihoods in Migration Contexts document. Like I said, it is literally hot off the press, if presses are hot in the electronic world. It just got its link last night. So this is a document that sort of emerged organically. There was a great piece of research that was done by Mercy Corps called Harnessing the Development Potential of Labor Migration. And it was such a great read that Scale decided to do a webinar. And the webinar had this really lively question and answer session, and people really wanted to dig into it more. It was really clear. So out of that conversation, we actually invited the participants from the webinar to form a learning group if they were interested. So we had a group of about 16, 20, the size varied, but people who were building on those questions that came up in the webinar, and they, and we really dug into the issues, right? What do we know? What do we don't know? Lots of desire for more tools. Like, we livelihoods actors, there's different kinds of migration. There's forced migration, there's climate change based migration. We don't even have good words for these things. We need tools. And so we tried to modify and build on some of the livelihoods tools that were out there. And you know what? I'm gonna say it. We failed. Like, what we came up with wasn't meaningfully different from what is already out there, which is why you won't see any kind of tool for that. Instead, what we pivoted to was the think piece that is this document. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. This think piece is really a practical guide for helping us figure out how to use the resources that we already have. If you're working on livelihoods in migration contexts, or trying to figure out what climate change is going to mean for migration in your areas, and how do we do this? This is a starter for the conversation. So, kind of what we know is that migration is a politically hot topic, right? But that political sensitivity, we recognize, is driving implementer behaviors. Donors suggest certain things in their proposals, and we respond to those proposals. And the research is kind of showing that there is a donor bias that is there, that's encouraging, managing, or containing, or preventing labor mobility. And that means that our livelihoods activities are not looking at the whole picture, because migration is legal and appropriate in some contexts. And there are benefits that could come to hosting migrate to countries that receive migrants and who send migrants. And the paper talks about this a little. One of the things that came out for me when I was doing it was how frequently countries are both sending and receiving migrants. The press would have us believe that it's all movement from low-income countries to high-income countries. But actually, there's a larger percentage that is low-income to low-income. And so what does that mean for the way that we program and talk about livelihoods if countries are both sending and receiving? And then another element that's touched on in the paper, there's a lot of more deep research out there, but is talking about the value of remittances. So that's money that is sent back home by migrants, which is now at $702 billion in 2021. So that's greater than official development assistance, ODA, and greater than foreign direct investment. And personally, I just think our livelihoods programs and our access to finance programs need to think about how we engage with remittances differently than we're doing now, because it's clear that migration is going to keep increasing. All the trends are saying that. USAID's climate strategy talks about it. We know that there are a lot of reasons for that, and migration is a very contextual issue. Go ahead and next slide for me. So one of the things you'll find in the document, I realize the print might be very small for you, so don't worry about it. Go to the document, you can see it there. But what this table does is, based on the research that is already out there on migration, talk about the pros and cons of sending, the pros and cons of migration from the sending or receiving countries perspective, but also from the migrant's perspective. I think many of us who work on livelihoods are more familiar with thinking of things in terms of households and communities. So I wanted to give a little bit more space to that migration, to the migrant perspective. But there's a lot of research around the positive contribution that migration can make in economies. So we've got that column there too, and backed up by the evidence. Go ahead and next slide for me. So what you're going to see, yeah, there we go. So the resources that you see here are just a few of the resources that are out there throughout the document. What I really tried to do was make sure that folks who are working on livelihoods or markets, employment programs or whatever, have access to the migration resources that are out there. That's one of the things that the learning group found was there's a lot more out there than we are familiar with as livelihoods practitioners or markets folks. We don't yet have the habit of going to look in kind of other disciplines, just like Maha was saying with the water people not recognizing how market programming might be applicable to them. I think livelihoods folks need to say the same with, we don't know all the work that's being done by migration folks on livelihoods. So what I tried to do was pull together those resources and highlight some of them. And we can go to the last slide. I think I've got just a few minutes to tell you kind of 5 of the recommendations that are highlighted in the paper. They will sound familiar, and I'm going to say that's a good thing. Understanding the incentives on all sides is always good practice, but I think we haven't always done that as livelihoods practitioners. And again, that's driven a little bit by the procurements, the grants and contracts, the calls for proposals, and the way they're framed tended to be about keeping people in situ rather than looking at the whole picture of livelihoods options that might be available to them. And I think that's why the recent case study on Nepal that you saw in the last slide is an interesting one, because it is a Feed the Future program, and Nepal is a country where migration is just really, really, it's a part of life. And I think, that's a good example of how we need to just shift our thinking a little bit. That second point, I've already made it several times, using existing data sources. That's kind of what drove the design of the paper in the first place. Supporting capacity building and training is not just about the way we think differently about employment programs and training programs and labor programs that we may already be doing, kind of linking to Ashley's work. It's also about recognizing that local governments may need support. If we're trying to say, look, these people are coming for climate change reasons or whatever. We've got an example here in the UK of a really badly handled migration situation. Local governments probably could use some capacity building and training so that we can continue to support those local solutions. The fourth point there around considering migration solutions that have win-win, obviously linked to the first one, and also linked to that chart that you saw in an earlier slide of thinking about all the pros and cons outside of our usual ways of thinking. And I think this last one is a big one. And for me, it has 2 parts. So international organizations that are in high income countries where migration is a hot topic should be using their advocacy budgets to really help make sure that the populations understand the economic benefits of accepting migrants. In many countries, there are shortages in healthcare, in agriculture, and migration could be an appropriate and legal response to that if we had the right systems in place. So that's one type of public perception that needs changed. But I don't think that we do enough work at our own field offices or in some of the countries that we work, sharing our big, expensive research pieces that we do. And there's one quoted in the document that talks about how Dadaab refugee camp actually has contributed a significant amount to the economy of that part of Uganda, Kenya. And we don't really share those kinds of the outcome of that kind of research with local communities and make sure that they also understand how things are how the markets are changing. So it's maybe a push again of making sure that if we're going to spend all this money on big pieces of research, that we share it with the communities who it directly relates to. And I won't be the first one to make that comment, but all that's kind of tied up in that one bullet point there. So that's the resource. And I really, I apologize to my fellow panelists for going over time when I was giving you such a hard time about it. But let's switch over to questions. I know there are a lot in the chat. I am going to get us going with a starter question, a question for each of the panelists. And maybe we'll just answer in the order that we presented in. And the question is, so scale is about giving people the resources that they need to transform markets and seed systems and agriculture. What do you think is the biggest challenge that implementers face when they're trying to use the resources that are already available? Ashley, do you want to get us started?
The biggest challenge is using the resources. Sometimes they're too long, too jargony. Where I work now, we try to stick to kind of 5-page documents. I think sometimes in the market, I don't know if you're digging at this in the market systems world, I think the bigger issue is that sometimes consultants or myself at times, we push people all the way to the best. If you remember those 4 tables to number 4. And I think we should be working with people in a much more incremental way. And there's complex market systems development kind of thinking, but there's also the first step for people it's new to, which is just a lot more common sense around sustainability. So I think, sometimes we push people too far when they're not ready, or maybe it's not appropriate to the context.
Thanks, Ashley. Tom?
Sorry. I think the biggest problem we have is impatience. We want everything to happen right away. And what we're seeing with, our savings group model using a fee-for-service agent is that this is a long-term solution. Yes, they're trained during a short period, but we should be looking at the value added post-project. And we should be saying, how are we preparing people? Because it is not a good thing to think that everyone's going to do everything at the same time. And we create more time poverty for people with this thing. We're just too impatient. We want everything there because the donor wants this done. But if we put in place the proper systems that reinforce themselves and continue to expand and grow, then we solve the problem rather than just pushing it off for a little while and then coming back and starting over again. So to me, it's impatience is the biggest issue.
Great. And that really ties into the localization agenda that USAID is talking about these days as well, as does Ashley's accessibility point. So Maha, go ahead.
Thank you, Carrie. Actually, the point that I want to talk about, maybe the main challenge that we believe that these documents, like the MBA framework, is just for programs people. So you find when the program people started to think how to embed the market-based programming or how they want to start to change their working, they find many difficulties from other people in the organization, like procurement people, financial people, M&E people, and the problem is they are somehow working, all of us, in silos, so we cannot see how we can work together on this. So maybe I should mention this point, that this document is really not just for people who are implementing. All the people who are engaging in the organization should be familiar with the way we are doing this so they can do real impact.
Great. Thanks, Maha. And I guess I'll just add to all of that, and maybe it builds on what Ashley was saying, is I think we need to get more creative about the way we share findings or messages or whatever. I've just become aware of what a burden it is to read long documents, and maybe we need those long documents to provide the details, but I keep playing in my own mind with the idea of how do we, I don't know, do a video version of our report, or something that's, I'm struck by how well BBC is able to tell me a bunch of important things in about 20 seconds. And it's not that I know everything that there is to know, but I know the key messages. We ought to get better at that if we want people to know where to find these resources. All right, we have a lot of questions. Tom, I may let you go first because we have a lot of questions for you here about how to prepare the community for PSP, the types of services that are offered, and whether they're alongside those services. How do we ensure that trainers are incentivized? Maybe you can dive into some of those questions that we've been getting on PSP, and then I'll go to you after that.
Sure.
Ash.
Just note that the very last question, I put in a response fairly detailed and some links to the research on the payments and what people are earning. So that's a much broader discussion than we can cover today. So when I look at the questions, I extracted the questions, so excuse me a minute. I have from my good colleague and friend Dan Norrell, how do we prepare the communities to be willing to pay for PSP services? This includes the NGO staff and community leader. It sometimes is challenging, but it's really all covered in the methodology and the way we approach the training, so that communities who get an agent who is an agent in training, a field agent, know that they're getting someone who's helping them get set up one group, and they're going to have to pay for the services in the future for more groups in the community. And we've probably make the most strides, even though that's repeated all the time, when the FAs graduate to become PSPs. We have a huge meeting inviting a lot of the local communities, leaders, people around. We try to bring everyone together, and we celebrate that they are now certified. And we put our sticker on and say, no subsidy left now, these people can do it. And in most cases, they run with it. There are cases where groups don't want to pay, and we do have some research around that. It's a many different things. But the great majority of them, if we have gotten the right agents, if they really are entrepreneurs, they are able, with the tools we give them in the training, to go out and actually market. So we start them marketing immediately upon certification, even as they're finishing up the 4 or 5 months remaining in the 6 groups that we've been giving them a small stipend to do. And most people are easy to transition from a stipend to income because it's generally 40 to 100% higher than what they're earning as a stipend. So I think it's a lot of methodology, it's a lot of communication, and you're right. I think we've struggled more with some NGO partner staff and that than we have with community leaders or the PSPs themselves. Some NGO staff are just stuck in the model of subsidy, 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 and that is not what this is. This is a market-based model. We're talking about, for PSPs, what do they provide? In this case, the main product is Silk, our savings group methodology. However, most of them offer financial education. It's a separate training for them. Some of them offer marketing basics, again, a separate training for them. And in many cases, not necessarily related to what we're doing, people offer agriculture services, to the point where we have designed a spin-off model that we call private agricultural service providers. And this has happened in a few countries, but we tested it mainly in Rwanda and in Senegal. In Rwanda, it was mainly youth that had never done silk, so they had to develop a different market. And in Senegal, it was all silk PSPs who took on it. We find that people really enjoy adding different activities to the point where we don't have a lot of ability to collect. But once they're organized, and once the key is, once their networks get registered formally in a country, and there's many different types of registration that are not very expensive, that they start looking at other services they can provide and getting trainings to do that, which have nothing to do with CRS and nothing to do with our partners. So that's sort of the typical thing.
It's a great reminder of how these activities can be a platform. And I think, Maha, probably you will also relate to the experience of some NGO staff really like the subsidies. And I think that's the challenge of what the MBP framework is trying to address as well, is having that market approach in mind from the very, very beginning. Now, Ashley, you've got quite a few questions there as well, and I know you answered some in the chat. But did you? Because I was facilitating. So, did you already answer the question on accessing, alternative ways of getting market information out of locations? I think Maha and I both have comments on how you do that too, but go ahead.
Yeah, I'm feeling that, I'll say a little bit, but I was thinking others here might even have more experience on this. What I'm going to do, there's a good resource from the DCD that talks about kind of more measurement in conflict affected environments, very fragile areas. I want to share that because otherwise, it becomes a bit of a cliche, but you just need to be a bit more realistic in what you can expect, be more flexible, think much more about your field agents. And as I say more generally in the resource, and if the context is so terrible that nothing can be done, then I would wonder from a job side, is this the right type of programming to be doing actually? But I can share that resource in here as well.
Great, thanks, Ashley. Maha, anything to jump in on how you get market data out of hard to access areas?
Actually, there's also another question for you. Maybe I need also to answer it, and then I'll answer.
Go for it.
Okay. I think one of the questions talking about if we do business models to be sure that these in negative positions or disadvantaged positions. So yes, actually, when you are working on markets, it's not that we want to just work for our target group and disadvantage the private sector. We try to work in this synchronization between the demand and the supply, between the target group and the suppliers. And yes, we do business models, and these business models should be always built in this aligned incentives and aligned capacities between both supplier and demand. So if your business model is not built on a real need from the demand side and a good profit from the supply side, you will not guarantee this durability of the business model that you are offering, or you are not really guarantee it will be sustainable. So yes, we do business model. The second question, Kerry, you were talking about data from affected.
Oh yeah, no, it was just how we study. The question originally to Ashley was how we study market access and prices when it's hard to reach those areas. And I think from my experience, and I a little bit wonder with the wording of this, if people are forgetting that prices aren't the only way that you look at a market. Right? Prices are one indicator, but they follow behind things like high demand, then the prices will change. And for me, markets are really the relationships between people. So if I was trying to look at an area that didn't have very good access, just like Tom was talking about the networks, you find out trader networks or savings group networks, or you speak to people who are making buying and selling decisions on a regular basis, which is I'll be honest with you, and most people are doing that just by doing their grocery shopping. And you use that as the foundation of what you need to dig into deeper. And I think this is a little bit what the resources that Mick is developing is trying to get at, is trying to help people understand where to look for market information. The Mick, I know, has a great frequently asked questions document that really digs into what kind of market assessment do I need to do. And there's a big difference between prices and, like you were saying, market information to build your business model, or market information to decide what kind of employment you really have a chance at. So yeah. Go ahead.
I just want to add one point, that the problem is that when we talk about market monitoring, we always think about prices, but maybe we miss this point that if the prices is high or even low, what is behind this change in the prices? And this is the point where it give us to look at these systems. Like, it's not necessarily in the supply and demand. It could be something in the supporting function, or maybe in the regulation. And from this, you can start thinking about the system as a whole. So you not just take the number as a price. You should look behind the number.
Right. And that looking behind, I think, is exactly the point that you're making, Ashley, in your paper as well, where you're saying we have to look beyond just the immediate thing in front of us to push ourselves a little bit further. I'm going to say to the right, because that's the way it is in the chart in your paper. Great. Thanks. If you do have another question, Tom, you've just got so many questions here. If you do have another question and want to raise your hand, we have about 10 more minutes to take questions, while we see if anybody has new questions that have popped into their mind. I want to go back to Tom. I've lost the question I wanted to ask you. I apologize, everyone. Maybe you covered this already, but can you tell us more about those add-on services that are quite common? You mentioned financial literacy, but what I'm really aware of is how all of these different pieces that we're talking about fit together.
So you need to back up a little bit, in the sense that, what does the individual within this group need?
Right.
And over time, because the savings group model, no matter who's doing it, there's many different models out there. The savings group model builds a lot of trust and social cohesion, and it's around money, where, we're bringing people together and making decisions. It's really important to people. And as they start awakening to their capacity to make their own decisions, to come together, that's when they start asking for add-ons. And so it really depends. Our most frequent add-on that people pay for is financial education, which is a process that we put in place, perhaps a little different. I mean, work with MFO at the beginning. We don't approach it as this is a product or service, let's look at it. We approach it as, what do I need to know in order to make decisions? Decisions around budgeting, decisions around expenses, decisions around savings, decisions around borrowing. We want to build the capacity of people to think through solutions, because we also know that, unfortunately, people often say, we'll do this and it'll take care of everything. And we all know that that's not true. We need many different products and services. So the idea is, the more people have knowledge, skills, and practices, and then within the savings group, they have access to finance to do these things, the more they want to learn. And we generally do the trainings with them, and they pay for them with the agent, but once every 2 weeks. You don't do it every week, it's just too much. And almost never more than an hour, trying to keep it to 40 to 45 minutes. So, you're leveraging where they are. excuse me, the agent comes to them. They don't come to us. It's at a meeting, after the meeting. People have said we could do it before the meeting. That doesn't seem to work. There's an incentive in all the groups to get to the meeting on time because you pay a fine if you don't. So it's much easier for them to do the training after the meeting.
Right.
And we definitely avoid doing trainings when a lot of loans go out. As soon as people have a lot of money in their hands, you don't want to do a training that day. So it's really relative. Getting agriculture inputs, particularly fertilizer and seeds, is very popular. Technical training, less much so. But, I think that comes. I think it comes with time. I think if the agents are trained enough where they can do some of it and link people to national extension services, then there is a value to doing that. But it all depends. I mean, we have those that do linkages between people and a company that builds latrines. There's people in the groups that want a latrine. Here's a company. They get, $10 or something for each referral that leads to a contract. And so it really depends. There's a lot of innovation out there that we don't even collect because there's no real digital record keeping. We're working on that now. We're just trying to move into that space where then you can collect a lot of this information forever. You have to pay for it, whoever is hosting it, but it's a forever because you only collect data during a project. You don't do much else. So it's really variable. But I would say that financial education is the one that is most asked for of anything we offer. And after that, it would be access to fertilizer, even before seeds. It's fertilizer, good fertilizer on time, and that has been very popular.
Everywhere are in alignment with that. That now it's a whole different fertilizer market out there. And I really like what you said, Tom, about what does the individual need, because I think that's where the Livelihoods and Migration Learning Group kind of landed, was that we weren't really looking at these issues from the perspective of the individual. We were giving them a certain piece of information because that's what the donors had asked us to focus on, but we didn't really look at labor across all of their potential labor opportunities. And therefore we didn't dig into, was it safe? Was it legal? Was it, any of those other things? So I feel like some of that, some of what you're saying that was learned through the savings group stuff links to what we were talking about in the learning group, but it also links to, Ashley, what you were saying in terms of a more systemic approach to labor issues, right? That's what we need to be thinking about. Ashley, and it doesn't have to just be Ashley, because I know you're not a seeds expert necessarily, but do you want to take this question that just came in on improving the quality of seeds when there are no seed laws? So this is a systemic question about regulation and policies and that.
I'll give it a go, but yeah, my focus is outside of ag. Other people do the hard work in ag, and then when it comes to the kind of off-farm, non-farm jobs, and even agricultural wage labor, that's where I focus a bit more. But I would say, there is quite a lot of work within their market systems in our world working in seeds. I think a lot of the work has actually even come from that, back from Catalyst like a decade ago. I can share some resources in there. A lot of that is about the kind of off-replicated work about smaller packets, helping businesses with the supply chains. I mean, that isn't quality per se, where it makes sure there's quality is higher quality on the market. A lot of the work I do now in Southeast Asia in different contexts is very much around contract farming. So we're working with larger businesses who are providing those inputs, and they are able to provide that kind of quality. They're able to check it. Perhaps I would turn the question around though and say, why it'd be valuable to understand why there are no seed laws. Are there kind of vested interests there but are holding it back that you could maybe try to work towards? Or is that just like a lack of innovation in the sector that you could be trying to bring in with your program?
Absolutely. And we've got time for one last question. Maha, will you forgive me if I take your question? Because I was just out in Ethiopia and I lived there for several years. So I maybe can help more Ethiopia specific one. the situation the question is, how can we monitor market prices where there's a lack of stocks and there's not an internet connection, and transport is very difficult for supplies? For example, what's happening in Tigray, Ethiopia right now. And I think you're talking about absolutely the most challenging situation. And I would say that the best approaches are probably staying really adaptive. We have the tools to look at systems and market systems. You can use your phone and call people and get what information you can when the internet is down. But the two resources that Maha highlighted at the end of her presentation that talked about adaptation in emergencies have a lot. There's one of them is only another list of tools about how to be more adaptive, how to build that in. And I think that's probably the key, because a situation like Tigray, and I could name 10 other situations that are fast moving crises around the world. It's about starting with what you know how to do and the resources that you've got, building in the community participation. There's some great stories out of Nepal right after the earthquake, and how it was actually the business community who had all these great links and got aid out there much more quickly because of their networks than humanitarians or the government could. So you work with the networks that you have, and then you adapt. You just constantly build in to your practice and your programs that adaptation. I think that is the best way to do it. All right, we've got 3 minutes left before we need to wrap up. And so I'm going to do a quick whip around panel. Are there any last thoughts or any last things that you want to say about resources that are out there, or ways that we should be using this information? Last words of wisdom for us today. Tom, let me start with you, and then I'll go to Maha and then Ashley. We won't make him be first every time.
That's a hard question. I'm not really sure what to say. We need to really think through our processes and look at collaboration with communities as opposed to projects with communities. Yes, we are stuck in a cycle where donors fund the projects, but we as development practitioners and as coming from development organizations, we need to be in constant conversation with the communities so that we're bringing forward what they have to say. I'm always astonished when people say they know what communities want, and I'll go and I'll simply spend the night with them and listen to what they have to say, and it will have nothing to do with what people telling me the communities want. Yeah. Because I don't say, what do you want? I lead a dialogue, and I try to think through, and that's where I see Savings Group as a really great platform. I don't see it as an end in itself, as a platform that provides financial tools and skills and leads people to wanting to have dialogues on other things they want. What can we do for our children in education? What can we do with healthcare? How can we grow more nutritious crops? How can we address climate change? These are real questions that communities ask.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. That's some great words of wisdom. Maha, over to you.
Thank you. I'll take just this generic advice that, like, for an example, for this webinar, we really presented a great resources. Like, you can look at it at different resources, but really the idea is how to see these resources fit together. So it's not just one resource that you can depend on. No, we are working on systems, and all these resources, like, maybe like explaining an idea, but you will get the real impact if you could manage to put all these resources as integrated, and how you can manage to use all the findings from them and integrate them into your work. So this is the idea, how to see the resources fit together.
Great. Thanks, Maha. And Ashley, over to you.
So, I mean, this was such an amazing webinar. I got quite a lot of questions that were less about jobs, but they just showed how like everyone is like your like geniuses around market dynamics and agriculture and the change there. So my parting comment, you know, if you're taking a systems change approach in agriculture, can you bring it over to jobs? Like I've worked on, you know, quite large USAID programs where we do this really clever MSD stuff with smallholder farmers, but then it would just be, well, let's just give out cash and training to be able to get jobs. So why not carry over that same level of sophistication, which we're doing, into the employment side? So, you know, if you're interested to get some tips on how to do that, hopefully this webinar was useful, or hopefully that the resource we shared could be useful here as well.
Yeah. So I've just reposted the survey for this session. We'd love to hear what you think, in particular, because we know there's going to be a Scale Point 2.0. If there is stuff that this webinar has brought up for you, tell us, and we'll try to make sure that it gets into the discussion and the planning for Scale 2.0. It's been great to have all you panelists here. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspectives. And I just want to end on an echo of what Tom has already said. I think sometimes we bring too much hubris and pride to the conversation, and I fully believe what Tom has just said is that we need to be listening to communities and recognizing how much is already there. So if there are ways that we can bring these resources and ideas that we've talked about to the communities, we also want to hear about that. I think it's why we're really here, isn't it? It's like, that's what we want. That's what sustainability looks like. That's what localization looks like. So we've got some great resources out there, but we need to make them really do their work and get them out to the communities. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for spending some time with us today. We loved having you here. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.